In life, seeing is believing, but in audio, what you see isn't what should guide your decisions. In audio, hearing is believing. That's why equal loudness comparisons are so important. Applying a high-end boost and a low-end boost may make your track sound fantastic, but it's only when you make that equal loudness comparison that you actually get an objective impression of whether you've improved your audio or not. So what if there was an EQ that took into account the perceived loudness of any boosts and cuts? An EQ that was far more about hearing and not seeing. An EQ focused solely on complementing the music and not clouding the listener's judgment. This is Natalus. Looking at the Natalus EQ, it kind of has a nautical kind of vibe to it with the large circular controls like portholes on a ship. The name Natalus is actually given to a bat, one with very large ears. Bats notoriously use their ears instead of their sight to plan their route, to make their decisions, and that's exactly what we should be doing in audio. So for this EQ, I'm not going to get bogged down in technical jargon about exactly how the circuit is modelled, exactly what the tolerances are and how they affect the sound. We're just going to touch upon how it functions. But most importantly, we're going to be listening and understanding how and why the building blocks of this EQ create such a unique sound. So first up, I'm just going to play the track, and here I've got Natalus on the track stems, so in essence I'm performing stem mastering. You'll notice a couple of things. Firstly, the tone of each stem changes depending on how I'm applying the EQ, obviously, but nothing gets harsh or muddy, it just kind of sounds better, and that's largely down to the transformer emulations in the plugin, which we'll touch upon in a moment. But this EQ is really about colour, saturation and vibe. Now this track is already pretty crunchy, it's got some real feel to it, and using the Natalus I'm just going to add to this. I'm going to create something that in comparison sounds kind of over the top in terms of saturation and crunch, but notice how even though it is undoubtedly aggressive, it still doesn't sound bad. Now bad is kind of a subjective thing, and so is EQ, so try and listen to what it's adding to the sound and how it's controlling the transient information through the saturation. You'll notice that I'm only applying boosts on the EQ because although you can apply cuts, the boosts are where the real magic lies.
What you got? What you got? What you got, baby? Tell me. Oh, it's what you got, baby. Tell me.
So just to briefly explain what's going on here without getting too technical, you have two transformer stages on the EQ, one on the input and one on the output, and this peak level control is very important. The peak level control is adjusting the dynamic range available, governed by the transformers, and biasing the EQ in between the transformers. So having the dial at the highest +14 setting means that there is a greater dynamic range because the output of the output transformer is raised. So no additional saturation is occurring within the EQ by having this up high. Having the dial down at +5 means that the dynamic range is reduced because the output of the input transformer is raised. So having that dial all the way down means you're essentially turning up the level going into the EQ. You're going to get far more saturation as the level coming in is far greater, so the dynamic range you have available is lower because it's being pushed into the EQ and subsequently the output transformer. As you increase the dial, it's giving you more dynamic range, saturating the input transformer less and raising the output of the output transformer. As well as a low cut which is placed in between the input and output transformers, you can also turn the EQ on and off, and this is different to a bypass switch because it takes the EQ out but leaves the transformers in, so you're still benefiting from that saturation. Let's have a listen to what happens when I take the EQ out. You're still getting the smooth saturation and crunch from both sets of transformers. This is with no EQ applied to any instance of the plugin, essentially just bypassing the plugins so you have no saturation from the transformers versus having the saturation. The transients come down and you're left with far more of the body of the music. Notice also how the clipping on the master output channel in Pro Tools also goes away.
You got what you got, what you got, baby, tell me.
So much of the beauty of this unit comes down to the transformers, but it's important to understand that these aren't the sole providers of the tone of this plugin. Despite the transformers playing an integral part in the sonic makeup of this unit, there's an awful lot more going on under the hood here that has been precisely modelled. The peak level control may most obviously affect the dynamic range of the material you feed into the unit, but it's also what controls the voodoo of this unit. The plugin emulates how this peak level control responds to transients magnetically in a similar way to a tape machine. If the input signal is raised, saturation and clipping occurs on the input transformers. Then the signal comes into the EQ with all the saturation already present. Once you've pushed it hard, you'll saturate the output transformer, resulting in less peaking density of your signal, so the transients are reduced due to that saturation and clipping. When you do this, you're focusing more on the body of the music. The transients aren't impeding on your judgment because they're lessened. We don't need to go into the depths of the design, in the same way as a guitarist may not know exactly every single scale and mode and technically how they fit over a specific chord. Some guitarists lead with their knowledge of theory, some lead with their stomach. They make note choices with their gut. Two different approaches that both work but achieve a completely different outcome. There's also a mono version available, which here I've got on the bass guitar stem. The original hardware unit of the Natalus EQ actually just had one set of controls, but was a stereo console EQ. The plugin emulation is true to the stereo, albeit with two sets of controls to allow for greater functionality like mid-side and individual control over the left and right channels, but creating a truly mono version is a lot more complex than it sounds. You can't just emulate one side of the EQ and call it mono version because there's a lot of interplay between the two channels, but a truly mono version is also available for any mono instruments. So if you're looking for a really precise surgical EQ where you can dig in and strategically remove or boost certain frequencies, there are plenty of other EQs out there that you can use. But if you want an EQ full of saturation, life and crunch, one that urges you to go with your gut and make choices based on feel, then this is the EQ for you. Check it out on the Plugin Alliance website now and grab your free trial to experience it for yourself. I'll see you again soon. Take care.
You